Welcome to This Explainer. Right, let's step back in time today to look at a period of just profound global transformation. I want you to imagine a world where massive, centuries-old empires are suddenly crumbling to the ground. And out of the dust of those 19th century colonial giants, entirely new nations are struggling to be born. We're going to examine the parallel journeys of sovereignty in two vital, highly complex regions, the Middle East and Africa. Both of these regions experienced intense, really difficult local struggles over identity, resources, and self-rule as they navigated the rather perilous journey of nation-building throughout the 20th century. Okay, let's dive right into this and run through our roadmap for today. We'll cover the architects of division, Middle East borders and nationalism, Middle East conflict and leverage, followed by Africa's independence wave, its triumphs, tragedies, and apartheid, and finally, the enduring legacies we still see today. Starting off with Section 1, the architects of division, lines on a map. So picture this. When World War I ended back in 1918, the Ottoman Empire, which had literally ruled much of the Middle East for 4 centuries, just collapsed. And this left a massive political vacuum. But instead of immediate independence for these lands, the 1920 San Remo Conference formalized what's known as the Mandate System. Under this system, European powers, mainly Britain and France, stepped in to administer former Ottoman territories on behalf of the League of Nations. So they were governing places like Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And by doing this, they essentially planted the early seeds of long-term conflict, mostly because local populations suddenly found themselves right back under a new form of foreign administration. What's really interesting about this history is the striking parallel between these two regions. In the Middle East, the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement saw Britain and France carve up Ottoman lands. But decades earlier, the 1884 Berlin Conference did the exact same thing to Africa, where European empires effectively divided the entire continent among themselves. Both of these regions suffered deeply from colonial architects who just drew arbitrary lines. They split united ethnic groups apart, and on the flip side, forced historic rivals to live together within the exact same borders. It perfectly and tragically set the stage for intense future struggles over sovereignty. Moving on to Section 2, Middle East, Borders and Nationalism. The Middle East transformed at a truly breathtaking pace. We start with those colonial mandates in 1916 and 1917, but then by 1948, Israel declares independence. Less than 2 decades later, the map shifts again with the 1967 Six-Day War, followed shortly by the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the global oil embargo. By 1979, we see both the groundbreaking Camp David Peace Treaty and the Iranian Revolution. It's this incredibly dense, cascading sequence of events where former mandates rapidly morphed into independent, though often warring, modern states. Now, to really grasp those conflicts, we need to understand Zionism. This was a movement calling for a Jewish homeland, which gained a lot of early momentum after Theodore Herzl organized its first Congress in 1897. It soon received British diplomatic sponsorship through the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Crucially, though, the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II deeply intensified Jewish immigration to Palestine. This brought immense demographic shifts to the region as populations urgently sought safety and sovereignty. And this brilliantly illustrates how two powerful, overlapping nationalist movements were suddenly set on a collision course. On one hand, you have Zionism seeking a sovereign Jewish homeland in Palestine. On the other hand, Arab populations across the region had developed strong nationalist movements of their own, aimed at resisting European control and Zionist settlement to secure Arab sovereignty. These two immense pressures collided, creating a highly volatile contest over territory, identity, and ultimate political power. Which brings us to Section 3, Middle East, Conflict and Leverage. 700,000. That's a massive number. It is the approximate number of Palestinians who fled or were expelled in 1948 when Israel declared independence. The declaration immediately triggered the Arab-Israeli War, and this conflict resulted in what Palestinians call the Nakba, creating a massive refugee crisis that has remained unresolved for generations, generating ongoing regional instability. A complete cascade of conflicts quickly followed. In 1956, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This provoked a joint British, French, and Israeli invasion that ultimately failed, which elevated Nasser as a really powerful symbol of Arab nationalism. Then, in the 1967 Six-Day War, a swift military victory by Israel dynamically shifted the region's borders. Israel took control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. The actual physical landscape of the Middle East was being fundamentally redrawn through conflict. And those ripple effects, they didn't just stay in the Middle East, they reached the entire world. Following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was launched by Egypt and Syria, OPEC's Arab members imposed an oil embargo. This caused severe energy shortages across the West. It proved unequivocally that petroleum resources carried enormous global political leverage. Regional Middle Eastern politics were now capable of basically holding the global economy hostage. Okay, let's shift gears to Section 4, Africa, the Independence Wave. So pointing our focus south to Africa. Decades after the Berlin Conference, the timeline of African sovereignty accelerated dramatically right after World War II. Weakened European empires, combined with the moral and legal arguments for self-determination found in the United Nations Charter, sparked rapid change. Ghana led the way in 1957 as the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence, followed very quickly by the Congo in 1960. It was this breathless era of newfound political freedom, stretching all the way to Nelson Mandela's historic election in 1994. So the crucial point is that this incredible independence wave didn't happen in an ideological vacuum. It was heavily driven by Pan-Africanism. Championed by newly empowered leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Pan-Africanism boldly argued that Africans shared a common identity and destiny. This intellectual movement provided a powerful unifying ideological counterweight to those arbitrary divisive borders that had been imposed by colonial rule. But here's the reality. Declaring independence is really just step one. Each new government faced monumental, practical tasks of building a nation-state from scratch. Think about it. They had to write entirely new constitutions, train national armies, rapidly expand educational systems, and attempt to create stable, modern economies out of systems previously designed only to extract wealth for Europe. It was an absolutely enormous, daunting challenge to translate political freedom into broad prosperity. Let's look closer at that in Section 5, Africa, Triumphs, Tragedies, and Apartheid. Unfortunately, one of the most devastating crises to emerge was the rise of kleptocracies. In places like the Congo, independence in 1960 quickly collapsed into civil war. Eventually, Mobutu Sese Seko seized control and renamed the country Zaire. His authoritarian rule became the literal textbook definition of a kleptocracy, as he plundered the nation's vast mineral wealth for decades. It perfectly illustrates the tragedy of resource wealth being used to fund conflict and corruption rather than actual national development. These new nations took vastly different paths, though. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere managed to consolidate power and build a one-party socialist state through his Ujamaa Village program, focusing heavily on self-reliance. Conversely, in Nigeria, the struggle for national cohesion descended into horrific civil strife. The Biafran Civil War, lasting from 1967 to 1970, killed up to 2 million people through devastating combat and famine. Meanwhile, at the southern tip of the continent, nation-building faced a different kind of horror: apartheid. This was South Africa's system of institutionalized racial segregation, brutally enforced under laws like the Population Registration Act. But it was deeply and courageously resisted by civil society. The African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela and supported by figures like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, fought this system through protest and immense global pressure. This monumental struggle ultimately culminated in the historic 1994 election of Mandela as South Africa's first Black president. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final segment, Section 6, Enduring Legacies Today. 800,000. That is the estimated number of Tutsi killed by Hutu extremists in roughly 100 days during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. This exposed the catastrophic, horrific consequences of ethnic division and the stark failure of the international community to respond. In its aftermath, realizing the desperate need for regional solutions, African leaders sought stronger institutions, eventually creating the African Union in 2002 with a mandate to actively intervene in conflicts. Back in the Middle East, the legacy of this nation-building era continues to shape our world right now, largely through sectarianism. The borders drawn a century ago by the Sykes-Picot Agreement forced different communities into fragile states, contributing to deep-rooted ethnic and religious tensions, like the Sunni-Shia rivalry. These fault lines were further intensified by major events like the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which violently reshaped regional alliances. Combine this with the unresolved issue of Palestinian statehood and the world's ongoing dependence on Middle Eastern oil, and you can see exactly why the region's internal politics consistently carry massive global significance. So, as we look at today's headlines, how much of our modern world is still defined by the arbitrary lines drawn on a map a century ago? The complex, sometimes triumphant, and often tragic nation-building of the 20th century in the Middle East and Africa isn't just distant history. It's the very blueprint of our current geopolitical reality. Thank you for joining me in this explainer, and keep exploring these fascinating histories.